On the night of August 24th, 2001, an Air Transat flight took off from Toronto to Lisbon. At 39,000 feet over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, both engines of the plane suddenly shut down because they had run out of fuel. All that was visible below was water, and the nearest airport was 120 kilometers away, making it impossible to reach. It seemed like there was only one outcome: death. Was there a miraculous twist to this flight? Let's dive into this terrifying story that will leave you shocked. On the evening of August 23, 2001, Canadian Airlines Air Transat Flight from Toronto was getting ready to head to Lisbon, Portugal from the airport. Since it was going to be a 7-hour non-stop flight, they loaded 48 metric tons of fuel after doing the regular service and maintenance checks. The aircraft was an Airbus A330, which was considered the most advanced and safest plane at that time. Captain Robert Piché, who was 48 years old, had 16,800 flight hours under his belt, while the first officer, Jager, had also flown for 4,800 hours. Both of them had flown the Airbus A330 many times before. In no time, the flight had 293 passengers on board. 13 crew members board the plane, and around 9 p.m., it takes off from Toronto Airport. The pilot slowly turns towards the Atlantic Ocean, heading for Lisbon. Just a few minutes in, the plane reaches its cruising altitude of 39,000 feet. On long flights like this, the pilot doesn't have to do much, since most of the work is handled by the autopilot system. The pilot mainly monitors the situation and periodically updates the control tower about their location. 4 hours have passed since the flight took off, and everything has been normal so far. Most of the passengers on the plane were fast asleep when, in just a few minutes, the aircraft reached the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. That's when Captain Robert Piché noticed something strange on the control panel of engine number 2. The readings were off, which set off alarm bells. Around 1 a.m., the pilot saw that the oil pressure in the right engine had shot up, while the oil quantity was low and the oil temperature was reading low as well. Both pilots were seeing this kind of error for the first time in their careers. Because whether it's a scooter or a plane, when an engine runs for a long time, its temperature usually rises. But here, the temperature was dropping rapidly, which was definitely not normal. So both pilots immediately check the flight manual, but they find nothing helpful. Without wasting any time, one pilot calls the Maintenance Control Center of Air Transat in Canada and explains the problem. All they get in response is to keep monitoring the error. As soon as we find out anything about this, we'll get in touch with you. Even though the cockpit was showing faulty readings, there weren't any problems during the flight. So the pilot relaxed, thinking maybe a faulty sensor was giving a wrong oil reading. But what happened next was an incident that's still written in black letters in aviation history. Anyway, about half an hour passed, and then another advisory message popped up on the cockpit screen in front of the captain. This one wasn't about oil. It was related to fuel. Actually, commercial airlines have fuel evenly distributed in their wings, but the screen showed a warning that there was less fuel in the right wing compared to the left wing. However, the pilot didn't think it was a big deal because warnings can pop up even when the fuel difference is just a few liters. So, he opened the crossfield valve to balance the fuel between the wings, and this time he did the same thing, evening out the fuel. But then, after about 10 minutes, the captain saw a low fuel warning on the display. They only realized when they checked that the fuel in the right wing had dropped again. And now, even combining the fuel from both wings, they didn't have enough to reach Lisbon. At that moment, the plane only had 7 tons of fuel left, which was just 6% of the total capacity, and it was running low fast. The pilot had no choice but to divert the plane, so they decided to land at Lisbon Airport on the nearby Azores Island and immediately got in touch with the traffic control there. The conversation went like this. Both pilots were really worried about why the fuel was running low and whether they would even make it to Las Vegas airport. The captain quickly told the flight attendant to check the right wing through the window to see if there was any fuel leaking. But it was so dark out that the flight attendant couldn't see anything. The situation was dire, with 1 ton of fuel running out every 5 minutes, and they only had about 25 minutes worth left. It was clear that reaching the Terceira Island was looking bleak. That's when the maintenance team spoke to the captain. The suggestion was made to take the plane up to 20,000 feet to confirm the fuel leak, but the captain flat out refused. He figured that even if we confirmed the leak, we wouldn't be able to maintain 39,000 feet, and at least if we could glide from 39,000 feet, we could cover a few more kilometers. Suddenly, the right engine caught fire, confirming the leak. This caused chaos among the passengers inside, and the plane started shaking. That's when the captain told everyone to stay calm and sit tight. The plane had only 45 tons of fuel left and just 1 engine, making it impossible to cruise a plane of that size. Gradually, the plane's altitude started to drop. There were only 600 grams of fuel left, and it was still 240 kilometers from its destination. Just as the captain feared, the left engine burned out due to running at full throttle, leaving the flight gliding over the Atlantic Ocean without any engines. The power system also failed, plunging the entire cabin into darkness, although the cockpit had all the important equipment running on emergency support. The airport was 120 kilometers away, and the plane had descended to 30,000 feet. If the plane couldn't glide to the airport, it would have to land in the water, which is risky. So the crew members quickly started prepping the passengers. Landing in the water can be really dangerous because of the impact, and even if they survived that, they could still drown. Gliding a big commercial plane is really tough. It's all about keeping everything in the air. The control system was dependent on the pilot, who was manually adjusting the lever. The plane's altitude was dropping at 200 feet per minute, meaning the 306 people on board were facing the possibility of life or death within the next 15 minutes. A few minutes later, the distance between the plane and the airport had reached 15 kilometers. At that distance, it's recommended to keep the flight altitude at 3,000 feet, but this plane was still at 13,000 feet. If the captain had tilted the plane forward to quickly lower the altitude, there was a 90% chance of a crash landing. In that situation, the pilot made a 360-degree turn right there, which kept the distance between the plane and the airport the same, but the altitude dropped from 8,000 feet to 5,000 feet. That's still 2,000 feet above the recommended level. And since a 360-degree turn wasn't an option anymore, the pilot turned the plane towards the airport runway and did a few S-turns. This zigzag pattern gave the plane some extra time to lower its altitude. Normally, during landing, they use flaps and engine thrust to keep the nose of the plane up. The pilot couldn't deploy the flaps without engine thrust because doing that would have increased drag from the air, causing the plane to tilt forward and crash. So, the pilot decided to land with the flaps off, which led to a pretty hard impact between the plane and the runway. In just 12 minutes, 8 tires blew out, and the plane started skidding to the side. But the captain wisely applied the brakes slowly. And finally, the plane came to a stop. Just then, there was a huge explosion in the landing gear, which caught fire. Even though the emergency crew near the runway quickly put out the fire, the brave pilot of Air Transat Flight 236 saved the lives of 306 passengers. To this day, it's the only plane in history that glided for so long without any engines and still managed to reach its destination. But the big question was, what went wrong? When they investigated, it turned out that during maintenance in Toronto before takeoff, The engineers had changed a part of the plane's engine, and it didn't fit perfectly. That's why the engine started to vibrate in that part, which caused the nearby fuel line to burst. The pilot also messed up by not paying enough attention to the fuel leak and leaving the crossfeed valve open for too long, which led to fuel from engine 1 leaking into engine 2 and running out of fuel. What would you do in that situation? Let us know. You can check out more videos like this on our channel. Thanks.